When my father first let me into the office, he did it the way people hand down heirlooms. Slow, with a little ceremony and a lot of expectation. "This place keeps our name alive," he told me, closing the heavy glass door behind us so our voices wouldn't drift into the manufacturing floor. He set a battered ledger on my palms like a talisman. His name is Martin Hale. The company is Hale Precision. 5 decades of machine parts, Sunday lunches that turned into strategy sessions, and a payroll that runs half the town. Growing up, our family meals were less about catching up and more about quarterly projections. Business was not a thing we did. It was who we were. I'm Kira Hale. I ran operations, which in a family business means you are equal parts a problem solver and a therapist. I learned to read balance sheets before I learned to cook. My mornings started with coffee, cool enough to sip while I skimmed emails, and end with inventory calls at midnight. I knew every supplier by voice, every aging piece of equipment by the sound it made when it decided it was done. People in town greeted me like kin because, in a way, I was their paychecks, their summer hours, the scholarship fund my father insisted on. My pride wasn't flashy, it was pragmatic. I wanted the company to be sturdy and useful, to be the kind of legacy that didn't need speeches. Emily is my sister. She is quick in thought and motion, and she always liked the parts of the company that showed. Sales meetings suited her. Charisma, presence, the sort of appetite for spotlight that eats small rooms and leaves them wanting more. As kids, she loved dressing up in my father's ties and walking around the showroom as if she owned the place. When our father asked who wanted to run Hale someday, Emily's hand went up with a smile that looked like confidence and a plan that smelled faintly of ambition. For years, the three of us operated like a slow-burning engine. Martin was the governor, steady, exacting, impossible to surprise. Emily chased new accounts and polished the company's face. I kept the back office from catching fire. There were small frictions, the kind families call differences of style. Emily liked the narrative. I liked the math. She loved a bold pitch. I loved the contingency plan. Those differences felt normal, even useful. I assumed the natural order. Father, then me, then the rest. It was never about having the loudest voice in the room. It was about making sure the machine kept humming for the people who depended on it. What was at stake wasn't an abstract title. It was the workshop where men who had worked there 20 years could still afford their mortgage, the health insurance package that kept a kid's diabetes managed, my father's reputation in a town that measured worth by how many years your name had been on the sign. If anything happened to Martin, this business would be the map we'd use to find ourselves again. That's why I stayed late so often, not for the numbers alone, but because I felt responsible for the little ecosystem that relied on this place. And because family is never just family. It's a boardroom, a balance sheet, and a fragile set of alliances disguised as dinner conversation. There were warning signs. A joke from Emily that landed wrong, a sly compliment she aimed at a client I had nurtured, but nothing violent, nothing dramatic. Just the soft, accumulating friction of two sisters learning how to orbit the same sun. I should have paid closer attention to the way she smiled when she took credit for something I'd fixed, or how she lingered in my office with questions that always seemed practical and never innocent. But pride makes you generous. And I had long ago decided that generosity was how you preserve trust in a family business. So I kept working. I kept the ledger neat. I kept my mouth politely closed when Emily told our father a story about me that simplified the truth until it fit a better narrative. I assumed loyalty would be reciprocal. I assumed the engine would keep humming. I did not yet understand how quickly assumptions can be traded for advantage. When Dad hit the floor in his office one late afternoon, the world folded into two kinds of time: hospital time and the rest of it. Martin Hale, precise, stubborn, the sort of man who called his heart, overdramatic when it skipped a beat, had a stroke that left him speech slow and glassy-eyed for weeks. I learned how to sit in a waiting room and hold a phone like it might be a lifeline. I learned the vocabulary of forms and IV lines. I learned the way grief can be clinical. I measured in blood pressure readings and the temperature of tea. Emily showed up at the hospital with a glossy resolve. "I'll handle the office," she said, putting on that particular smile that's half empathy and half sales pitch. She kissed Dad's forehead with a dramatic hand, and then, in front of the nurses, she leaned toward me and whispered, "You should rest." It sounded like a kindness and tasted like a command. At first, it was genuinely helpful. She took on calls, soothed vendors, kept the PR folks from leaking anything about Dad's condition. She walked into the plant, and people waved like she owned the place again. I signed a medical proxy where it was needed and trusted her to keep me looped in. Trust felt like the right currency in that frantic moment. That's the thing about trust. It's the easiest thing in the world to give away and the hardest to get back. Over the following weeks, small things started to tilt. An email she'd promised to forward never made it to my inbox. A meeting I'd been scheduled for showed up on the calendar as Emily to present. For a while, I chalked it up to hospital chaos, the kind of fragmentation that eats organization. But the gaps had an edge. Papers were refiled with new headers. I'd open a spreadsheet and find my notes gone, comments erased, entire rows relabeled under different project names. It was like watching a forgery get finer and finer. Emily was everywhere and nowhere. She was the sister kneeling by Dad's bed who stroked his hand and read him product brochures while telling him how she was holding everything together. She was the teammate who slipped the CFO, a man named Gordon Hale. No relation, just an unfortunate coincidence of surname and old-school loyalty. An offhand remark about my preoccupation with experiments in efficiency that didn't pay immediate dividends. She was the one who hosted the board members at her house and fed them stories about how she had stepped up while I supposedly spent nights at the hospital unable to focus. They say character shows in crisis. Emily's character in crisis looked practiced. The consolidation was surgical. She moved into PR, into client accounts, into the folders that used to say, "Kira, do not touch." She leaned on the plant manager with promises of bonuses and threatened quietly, with no raised voice, to pull accounts if he didn't get with the new plan. She made strategic calls late at night, calls I didn't hear. And when I asked about them, she said, soft and puzzled, "I was trying to protect you from stress." Protection became a cover for erasure. It wasn't just that she took things. It was how she rearranged the narrative so that taking looked like caring. She told the board a story where Dad was fragile and needed a flamboyant caretaker, and that the company needed a visible leader who could charm clients and steady the market. Kira's strengths are operations, she'd say to investors. But right now, we need a public face. Her face, her voice, her performances at fundraisers made her the face. Her plan to discredit me was not one dramatic unmasking, but an accumulation of insinuations engineered to make me look incompetent, distant, and emotionally compromised. The perfect trifecta for losing credibility fast. She fed selective facts to Gordon about missing compliance deadlines. She suggested that my midnight inventory calls were a symptom of disorganized thinking rather than commitment. She had legal draft a temporary leadership slate and quietly ceded it to the board with the emotional framing of stability during recovery. Each small misdirection was a strand in a net. The night before the board vote, she sat across from me at the hospice-style coffee cart near Dad's room, handed me a paper cup, and smiled like someone who just gifted you a kitten. "You should be proud," she said. "You built this place. I'm only bridging." I thought I smelled perfume and mint. It turned out to be adrenaline and the metallic aftertaste of betrayal. Board day felt like a trial by weather. The conference room hummed with conditioned air and polite gravity. Emily arrived in a suit that could have had its own brochure. She presented with the sort of effortless charisma that can make an empty idea sound historic. Then she began to layer in the allegations. A missed supplier deadline, a misplaced contract, a mistaken shipping schedule that she suggested with perfect feigned regret could have cost the company a critical client. She produced an email thread that, to anyone skimming, looked like my correspondence. It landed in the room like a physical accusation. I tried to respond. I tried to explain that the supplier had been notified, that the contract file was preserved, that the shipping error had been a mislabeling in a database I'd already flagged. Emily folded my explanations into a narrative of distraction. She smiled while she spoke my words slowly, as if translating them into something smaller. The board watched, comforted by the performance of order. Then came the part that stung more than the accusations. The look on Dad's face when I left the hospital to make the meeting. He was tired and not fully himself, but he looked at me with a sliver of recognition and a deeper resignation. It felt like getting your last ration of permission to act taken away in slow motion. By the time the vote happened, the atmosphere had crystallized. The board, composed of townspeople who wanted stability more than complexity, looked like it might sign away the rules in favor of the person who appeared to be steering the ship. Emily, animated and composed, spoke about the future. I sat quiet, my voice small in that particular theater. When the chair read the motion appointing Emily to the acting CEO role, pending Dad's full recovery, it felt ceremonial and final. She hugged me in the hallway after the meeting, as if we'd both survived something terrible and noble. Her embrace was warm and performed. There was a moment, a flicker of triumph behind her eyes, that I mistook for sorrow. Later, when I replayed that moment in my head, there was no mistaking. She believed she had humiliated me. She believed she had won. She left the building that afternoon, carrying what she thought were the keys to the kingdom. A temporary title, a board's nod, a town smile. I left carrying a ledger in a satchel and the kind of silence that's not relief, but a gathering of purpose. So the betrayal stacked up. The small erasures, the cultivated concern, the staged evidence, the boardroom theater. It was not a theft of objects so much as a theft of trust and story. Emily had shifted the frame to make herself the necessary daughter, the smart successor, the one who could pull the family through. In front of the board, she looked like Grace. In the quiet of my office, she looked like a thief in uniform. She thought she had the last move. She didn't know I had been watching the whole game. I tell you this part like it's a confession and a map at once, because the truth of what I did sits somewhere between filial duty and the only kind of violence a woman like me knows how to do. Procedural, patient, inexorable. Dad and I had always been private about the real instruments of control, not the press releases or the plaques, but the paperwork that actually moves power. He used to joke that the nicest thing you could give someone was an unreadable clause. It kept them humble. Months before the stroke, there was a day when he was lucid and irritable, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold, flipping through old stock certificates as if the edges would tell him something about his life. He called me in and for once looked at me the way I imagine he looked at that ledger when he handed it over, with the precise softness of a man deciding to trust someone with the hard thing. "I don't want anyone to fight over this when I'm not here," he said. He didn't finish the sentence. He never needed to. We went to Mr. Saunders, the family attorney, a man who smelled of pipe smoke and thought in paragraphs. In that office, while the city hummed outside, Martin signed a document, an irrevocable declaration that assigned controlling shares to me in the event that he became incapacitated. It wasn't dramatic, no last-minute, feverish signing with a camera crew. Just a folded paper, 2 witnesses, and his shaky signature at the bottom. He wrote my name, not with flourish, but with a tired certainty. Kira Hale, controlling shareholder and trustee of the Martin Hale Family Trust. He pressed his thumb to the ink like a seal. I put the paper in my purse and drove it straight to the lawyer's safe. I didn't tell Emily. I didn't tell Gordon. I told no one but Dad, who looked at me like someone handing a compass to a child and said, "Use it well." There was nothing theatrical in the exchange, only the weight of a promise. Why didn't I wave it at the board the minute he fell? Because power is a thing that can be brutal when offered prematurely. Used badly, it looks like opportunism. I wanted the law on my side and the optics to be clean. Emily was good at optics. I would not give her the chance to say I'd seized power in a moment of weakness or to paint me in the colors of a cold, calculating usurper. So I waited. I let her believe the stage was hers. While she was building her narrative, I did the quiet mechanical work that ultimately decides these things. Mr. Saunders filed the document with the transfer agent and had the trust recorded. He kept a certified copy at his firm and lodged another with the bank's fiduciary department. I had the original sealed and notarized and watched it move into official channels where it could not be whispered away. Every time Emily smiled and told a new story to a client or a board member, I was behind a desk getting stamps and signatures. I am not brave in a cinematic way. I am brave with forms and deadline letters and the deafening silence of ledger books. But legal filings alone do not win a fight of this sort. You also need people, the quiet stewards whose votes matter. So I set about fortifying the coalition I already had. I made it a point in the small hours to walk the plant floor and ask how things were going. I called suppliers and thanked them personally. I met with the union rep and listened without offering solutions until she trusted that I was listening for real. I reminded long-standing clients, casually and without drama, that the company would remain the same under my stewardship. None of it was a promise of revenge. It was prophylactic loyalty, earned and logged in quieter, less glorious ways than fundraising galas. Meanwhile, I also did something else that felt like cutting a safety line. I reorganized some family shares into an irrevocable holding under the trust's name. It wasn't theft. It was the activation of what Dad had already decided. Those shares, the ones that would determine who had the legal votes on the day of crisis, were now under the trust's custody with me listed as the controlling trustee. No public announcement, no trumpet, just the transfer agent's acknowledgement on a stamped letter that, when read coldly, carried the force of law. Then I set the bait. I fed Emily the illusion of victory because she was arrogant in the way arrogance always is, hungry for public theater. I let her run her campaign of small humiliations and staged competence. I answered her calls with bland professionalism. I congratulated her on contracts she'd secured. She believed she had cornered the narrative and, crucially, the board. That belief is a catalytic ingredient in power plays. It makes people act before they verify. On the night before she planned the formal dismissal, the night she planned to turn my life into a footnote, I sent an email to the board. It was calm, almost clinical. Notice of an upcoming legal filing and an attached certified copy of Dad's declaration. I didn't boisterously accuse her of anything. I simply placed the certified document on the table and let the bureaucratic gravity do its work. I watched from the next room as messages began to ripple through the board's chain. Questions emerged. Someone called Mr. Saunders. Someone else dug out an old stockholder roster. Emily, who had been rehearsing her speech about competence and stability, sent a flurry of messages asking for clarifications for procedural delays. Her confidence flickered in the small stuff, the way a soprano's hand trembles before the high note. What I had done wasn't a public unmasking. It was a legal and procedural checkmate. The paper trail established that, on paper, Martin had already placed the company's control where he wanted it. The board could argue optics, they could murmur about timing, but they could not plausibly claim they had majority control when the registered shares stated otherwise. I had taken nothing that wasn't already Dad's intention. I had merely given his handwriting precedence over her performance, and in the quiet calculus of a family business, precedence is everything. I walked into the boardroom like I was late for a meeting I'd already rehearsed 100 times in my head. Emily was already there, lit from below by the glow of a slideshow that had her name on the title slide. She wore a smile that had been airbrushed. It didn't reach her eyes. The board shuffled papers, folded their hands, leaned forward the way people lean toward stories they think will comfort them. She began to speak the language she'd learned to perform. Confident cadence, neat anecdotes, the polished cruelty of someone who thinks optics are the same thing as truth. She had prepared a packet, bound in plastic, with a photocopy of a document that, if accepted, would finalize the narrative she'd been building. That Dad had authorized her as acting CEO, and that any objections were procedural noise. She handed copies to everyone. The gesture practiced, theatrical, final. I didn't interrupt. I set my satchel on the table, unzipped it, and took out Mr. Saunders' envelope, the one with the certified copy and the trust's stamped acknowledgement. I laid it down in front of the chair of the board and slid another sealed packet across to the corporate council. The room smelled suddenly like copier toner and something older, the metallic tang of a decade's trust. Before we proceed, I said, there's a certified document the board should have before making any final motion. There was a beat. Then Emily laughed, a brittle sound. You mean that same paperwork you've waved at people before? Kira, with all due respect, timing matters. You don't get to play Deus Ex Machina now. I let her talk. She was good at talking. When she was done, the counsel opened the envelope. He read aloud, dry, the way men in suits read the weather report. My name, the declaration, the notarization, the transfer agent's stamp. He flipped to the copy Mr. Saunders had kept. The room cooled as if someone had lowered the thermostat. Is this authentic? Gordon asked. Yes, Mr. Saunders said from the doorway, because of course I had asked him to come. He stood there, a man of paragraphed sentences and tobacco memory, holding a second certified copy. Signed by Martin Hale, witnessed and filed with our office. The transfer agent has a registered acknowledgement. Emily's face moved through a sequence I'd seen on the plant when a bolt snaps. Surprise, then anger, then the quick, practiced composure of someone who thinks outrage will put them back in control. This is procedural, she shot, irrelevant to the board's decision about operational leadership. The council sighed like someone who had planned to be bored all afternoon and found themselves unexpectedly awake. Legal precedence is not procedural when it defines the registered controlling shareholder, he said. We can discuss optics. We can debate style, but the registry is clear. That should have been the end. For Emily, it was the end she had not rehearsed. She reached for the packet she had circulated, the one she believed would clinch the board's assent. With a hand that was almost too steady, she held up the photocopy and asked that her version be entered into the minutes. This is the authorization I received, she said. May I? Mr. Saunders asked, and took the paper with a single gloved movement. The way a coroner takes a delicate bone. He compared handwriting to the certified document. He looked at the notary stamps. He read the witness names. He tapped a pen on the table and then slowly produced another small piece of evidence. Correspondence between Emily and a local notary. An email chain with edits and a scanned image whose metadata showed it had been produced days after my father became unable to sign. The room felt the shift like a gust under a tent. You forged this, Mr. Saunders said, not accusing as much as stating fact, which for those assembled was worse than an accusation. Emily's face bled color, then drained. She stammered a defense that was half confession, half panic, a claim that she'd only clarified wording, that she'd acted in good faith, that she'd been protecting the company. The word protecting had been her favorite coronation phrase. In that moment, it sounded like a child reciting a scripture she no longer understood. Board members leaned into their own sense of dignity. The union rep, who sat with the quiet honesty of someone whose life is not made of spin, asked about contracts and the plant's day-to-day. Suppliers called in. Emails went from polite to pointed. The town's interest, always the soft pressure at our shoulders, became a force. The math and the law had tilted. The social ledger followed quickly. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I laid out the practical steps, the formal revocation of her acting title, the confirmation of my role as trustee and controlling shareholder, the transitional plan for senior management. I read the motion in a voice that kept itself small but exact. It felt both like recitation and ritual, a reclamation of authority by process rather than spectacle. When I said the words that removed her from the executive suite, Emily broke in a way she hadn't in public before. She stood, hands trembling, and accused me of betrayal. You took advantage of Dad, she said with the rawness of someone wounded. You used his name as a weapon. Your weapon, I said, was a forgery. There was a silence thick enough to spill. For an instant, I saw my father's face. Tired, precise, the evening he handed me the signed paper and said, "Use it well." I felt, with an odd, sharp tenderness, the rightness of how he had arranged things. It was not about triumph. It was about fidelity to the intention he'd set down when he could still choose. Emily left that week with a severance package and a town gossip tale that would take months to settle. There was no dramatic escort out scene, no shouting match on the steps. I made a choice in the aftermath that surprised some people. I didn't press criminal charges. I had the law on my side. I had the company to steer. Locking her in a courtroom would have been taking the town's wound and slicing it deeper. I wanted order, not blood sport. In the months after, I walked the plant more than ever. People said I seemed quieter, like someone who'd been up late with a ledger and emerged with fewer illusions. The ledgers themselves remained tidy. The paychecks still hit bank accounts on time. We weathered a late-term client scare and came out with a new supplier arrangement that made the plant leaner and steadier. Sometimes I catch myself checking the old office, the room where Dad used to sit and tap the desk when he was thinking. The building feels fuller now, as if a long-held breath has finally been released. I do not take pleasure in Emily's fall. What I feel more often is relief. A mapped resolution that lets the town go on, lets the workers know the work will continue, and lets me keep the promise my father made, that the company remain his name in the world, steady and useful. Power in a family can be a poison or a medicine. I used what was given to me as medicine. The moral is small and domestic. Be precise with the things that matter, and do not confuse spectacle with stewardship. The engine hums, the lights are on, the ledger is closed for now, and that is finally enough.